free to utilize the chat box. I'll be there as well. So hello everybody, welcome, and just want to present myself before we start. My name is Moniza Felsen. I'm one of the admissions officers, and I'm very happy to be able to welcome everybody in this chat. Oh, Joga, you finally get your mic working. So just some housekeeping important things to mention. Also make sure that if you're just joining the event, make sure that your mic is muted. So we don't have any like background noise during the presentation. And also, as I was mentioning earlier, feel free to utilize the chat box. Okay. So Vivian, if you give me the green light, I'll go ahead and start the official presentation.
Welcome everyone. I'm the founder of NYC Data Science Academy. It's our pleasure to have Ethan here to present his project today. And before we start the project presentation, we will have Manisa introduce who we are, what we do for 5 minutes. So if you have any questions, she will stay in this session to answer it. Thank you. Manisa, you may proceed.
Awesome. Let me just get my presentation here. Okay. Hopefully everybody will see my presentation. Let me know if you can see my screen. Oh.
Yes, I can.
Awesome. So, well, let's go back. All right. As I mentioned before, make sure to utilize the chat to ask your questions during this event, and make sure that your mic is muted to avoid any background noise during the presentation. We want everybody to enjoy and participate equally. So welcome. And this is a little bit about our school. If you guys just got here, my name is Manisa Felsen. I'm one of the admissions officers here in the school. And before we start, I promise I won't take much of your time. Just talk a little bit about us and what we do. If you're here, it's because you love data science, you're interested, you're considering joining our program. We are a data science school. We offer an accelerated data science training and data science related courses. We are very proud to say that we teach both Python and R, two programming languages that are very important for data science. Our bootcamp students, they work into industry projects. If you want to learn more about the projects that we elaborate with students, feel free to ask questions on the chat or also contact admissions. I'll give you guys the admissions contact soon. Also, one of the benefits of becoming a bootcamp student is that we prepare you for the job market. The ultimate goal when you become a bootcamp graduate is, we want you to get your first data science job, or if you're in a career transition, we want to get you in the industry. So we support all our graduates to get in the data science industry. We've been doing this for years now. We have over 2,000 alumni working, across the globe. And not to say, we're also rated the best data science bootcamp and the best data science online bootcamp in 2020 by switchup.org. Just quick reminders, if you're here because you're interested in data science and interested in studying with us, we do have some upcoming sessions. We have our remote live bootcamp. We have a session starting May 3rd and the next one July 6th. But if you still want to keep your job, we have a part-time option starting May 17th, and a full-time option. If you want a little bit more flexibility, both full-time and part-time online bootcamp are with pre-recorded lessons and one-on-one mentorship. I'm happy to answer any questions you guys may have. Just send your question through the chat about these different bootcamp options and start dates. And as I said, if you guys have any questions about the start dates, the program, anything related to the courses, feel free to email admissions@nycdatascience.com. All right. Thank you, Vivian. Hope you guys have a great event.
Ethan, feel free to share your screen and start the presentation.
So, hello, I'm Ethan, and I was a member of the last cohort that recently graduated, I guess like 10 days ago at this point. And I'm just going to kind of go through a couple of the projects I worked on in my time during the boot camp. So obviously feel free to let me know if you have any questions at all. So my first project I'm going to discuss is one where I try to analyze the MVP voting results for Major League Baseball. And so for the data I got, I used Scrapey to scrape the data from the MVP voting results data from baseballreference.com. And I also downloaded the data on just individual team records for the year, on a year-by-year basis from Kaggle. So and then I just joined the data together using the team abbreviation from the baseballreference.com with MVP voting results, as well as I just manually kind of map the team abbreviation and the team records based off of the whole team name in the Kaggle data for the team records, and I looked at data from 1950 to 2019. And just some quick background information. There are 2 leagues in Major League Baseball. The voters for the MVP awards are the writers, and there's 1 MVP voted for in each league. And for each league, 30 voters are selected from the baseball writers, and each voter will rank their top 10 candidates in the league. So a rank of 1 will be worth 10 points, a rank of 2 will be worth 9 points, and so on until you get to a rank of 10, which is worth 1 point to the player. And then at the end, the player with the most total points is declared the MVP winner. And there's no real criteria for MVP, just however the writers want to determine who the most valuable player was in the league in a given year. So my task was to find which statistics have the biggest impact on the MVP voting results, and also trying to look into see how the dependency on certain stats has changed over time, as the way that sort of baseball has been analyzed to change over time as there's been a greater introduction to advanced stats and advanced analytics, and trying to see if voters ultimately are relying more heavily on these metrics as they become more readily available and become more mainstream in just a general baseball discourse and discussion. So my points of focus were the traditional stats versus the more modern stats. And I looked at position player performance only. I removed pitchers from the data set. Performance trends were looked at by years and decades. The primary traditional stats I looked at were the Triple Crown stats, which are home runs, RBIs, and average, stats that traditionally have been used very heavily in baseball analysis to evaluate players and who's better than other players. And for more modern stats, I used wins above replacement. And I could share the slides afterwards, so the links also go deeper into explaining what each of these stats means and how they are calculated. And just the biggest difference would be the wins above replacement stats is incorporating things like defense and base running, in addition to, say, the batting stats, which home runs, RBIs, and average are a part of. So the very first thing I wanted to look at is just players leading the league in a specific category. How are they faring MVP voting? How has that changed over time? As can be seen kind of looking at these charts, is that looking at a stat like WAR here in the upper left corner of the charts, it shows that you go back to the earlier decades, the 1950s, the 1960s, 1970s, the players leading the league in WAR weren't necessarily performing well. MVP voting typically finishing somewhere within the top 5. There were certainly some outliers finishing outside of the top 10, in some cases outside of the top 15 or 20. And typically, while the player did do well in MVP voting, they weren't necessarily winning the award. Whereas you look back at the more recent years of 2000, especially 2010s, you see that the players leading the league in WAR are very frequently not only finishing in the top 5 of the voting, typically in the top 2 or 3, and really in general very likely to win the award, and really aren't falling outside of the top 5 at all. And you compare that to a stat like RBIs in the lower left corner, where you could see that players who led the league in the RBI in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s typically were faring very well in MVP voting, finishing first or second very commonly. Whereas you look more than 2010s, where these players just leading the league in RBI wasn't guaranteed you to just win the award straight up, where typically you would have, if you're going to win the award or finish very highly in the voting, you had to have a lot more to your overall player package. And so next, a similar way to look at just how league leaders performed in the voting results. I wanted to look at the number of times just a player who led a league in a category finished top 3 in the MVP voting. It's not necessarily winning the award, but are the players who lead a league in this category finished doing well in MVP voting? As can be seen here, looking at WAR on the far right of this graph, that in the 2010s, players leading the league in WAR are now very frequently going to finish in the top 3 MVP voting, much more than they were in, say, the 1950s or 1970s, and comparing that to, say, batting average or RBIs, which is in the middle of this chart, which shows that players leading the league in RBIs wasn't always guaranteed to finish in the top 3 of MVP voting, but generally finished fairly well. And that trend in the frequency of them finishing top 3 is slowly decreasing over time, outside of a slight jump in the 2000s. Next, I want to just look at a general correlation of how players are ranking in those Triple Crown stats, so home runs, RBIs, and average, and how they are ranking and how they are faring in MVP voting. It can be seen here that, in theory, the lower your MVP voting finishes, the better you do in the voting, because first is the best. And same thing with the aggregate Triple Crown rankings, which is their ranking home runs, RBIs, and batting average averaged out. So the lower number would be better, because lower number you're finishing higher to the top of the league in those categories. And you can definitely see there's a correlation here. Another thing I wanted to look at and do analysis on was the impact of overall team quality. So here I took, and just to determine a good team versus a mediocre or a bad team, I chose just a 90-win pace. I only selected that because playoffs is a bit of an arbitrary making the playoffs is a bit of an arbitrary benchmark, because the number of teams in the playoffs has changed over time, and using a raw number of wins was an arbitrary benchmark because over time the amount of games teams have played has changed. So I figured taking a 90-win pace over 162 game season, which is something that's generally the benchmark for a very good team, would be a good barometer for that. And it can be seen here that players on those very good teams tend to fare better than their contemporaries in MVP voting, which indicate that voters are considering that the overall quality of a team plays a factor here in how they evaluate an individual player, though it's also noticeable looking at the most recent data set from the 2010s that there's less emphasis on the overall quality of the team, even though there may still be a very slight impact. Next, I did the same piece of analysis, but looked at a player's rank in WAR. And again, you can see that there is a correlation between where a player ranks in WAR and where they finished the MVP voting. And again, you see a similar trend with the overall quality of the team, that it still matters, though it seems like the actual impact of the quality team has decreased a little bit over time. It's also noticeable that there's a bit more of a direct correlation between the player's WAR rank and MVP voting rank in the most recent decade, which certainly makes sense, as these metrics, which really didn't even exist 30 years ago, are now getting much more mainstream into the general baseball discourse and analysis. And really, it's something where now within the last 5 years or so, really becoming commonplace on TV broadcast or on the back of baseball cards. So it's something accessible to much more people, and not just hardcore fans seeking this out, but more casual viewers who may just be tuning into a game once a week, be introduced to this metric, and when they see it pop up, may be more willing to accept it and use it in their own assessment. Next, I want to see how the MVP winner's WAR compared to the actual league leader of WAR. So for that, I wanted to look at two things. One is where did the MVP winner rank in WAR, which is a top graph showing a player's rank in WAR within the overall league on a year-by-year basis over the course of the time frame, with each league broken out separately in different lines in the graph. It can be seen here that generally the player who won the MVP fared pretty well in WAR, pretty frequently was leading the league in WAR, even going back to the earlier decades. But there were certainly some blips in that where players who weren't particularly close wound up winning the MVP award. And also it's noticeable that in the very recent years, last 10 or 20 years, that players generally winning the MVP award are, if they're not leading the league in WAR, are still finishing in the top 3 or top 5 in the league of that metric, indicating that it's becoming more and more heavily valued. I think it's also noticeable in the bottom graph where you see how far off the MVP winner was from the league leader in WAR. So if the MVP winner led the league in WAR, they would have a score of 0, which is the lowest possible number. Whereas if the league leader in WAR had 5 or higher than MVP winner, they'd have a number of 5. And again, a similar trend that in recent years it's decreased. It's also, I think, important to kind of look at both of these charts in comparison together, because a player may rank 10th in the league in WAR, but be very close to the league leader in WAR, where if there's 10 players who were very closely in the overall value, whereas a player may finish second in the league in WAR, but may be very short of the actual league leader in that category because there was another player in the league who was just, the performance is above and beyond what you would expect from really anyone. And next, I want to see if there's just any trends as far as any types of teams or players that typically had a lot of benefited out in their MVP voting results perform much better than one would expect in the actual voting. And for that, I took a player's rank in WAR and their rank in MVP voting and kind of took that difference to decide either if your expected vote performance is above or below. So if a player won the award but finished 10th in WAR, would aggregate to 9 total points. And the flip side, if a player was first in WAR but 10th in the voting, it'd be -9 points because you finished 9 points slower. It could be seen here that the Chicago Cubs, Los Angeles Dodgers, and New York Yankees were the 3 highest overperformers in MVP voting result, just looking at it in this manner. And the Atlanta Braves, San Francisco Giants, and Seattle Mariners were the top 3 underperformers looking at it in this manner, which really to a couple of theories on why this may be happening. One I would have is the impact of market size, knowing that Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York, the 3 biggest overperforming teams, happen to be in cities that are among the biggest media markets in the U.S., have the biggest television audiences, and just have larger fan bases, and that may generate more discussion about these players over the course of the season as a whole, which may make them more well-known, and maybe people are just more likely to vote for them because they hear more about them, though it can't necessarily be given the entire reason because cities like Atlanta and San Francisco, while not quite as big, are still very large cities within the United States. And next, I wanted to just look at the same piece of analysis, but instead of looking at on a team-by-team basis, I want to look at it by individual player. And for here, from the entire data set, I have the top 10 overperformers in the data set and the top 10 underperformers in the data set. One thing that stood out to me is that the top 10 overperformers tend to be players that compile very high home run and RBI totals. And while the rest of their games aren't necessarily as well-rounded, they're not necessarily good base runners, aren't necessarily good defensive players, or play low-value defensive positions, whereas the bottom 10 players tend to be players who have much more well-rounded games, or just players who are repeatedly compete amongst the very top of the league, which can mean potentially voters are overvaluing specific categories like home runs and RBIs while also undervaluing other elements of a player's game. Also potentially mean that there's some voter fatigue going on where people just don't want to keep voting for the same player year in, year out, or just a player has such a high baseline of performance that even another extremely great season seems subpar by comparison. Just quickly in a more tabular form to look at this, I took the 1989 and 2008 MVP voting results. So the 1989 AL MVP voting, Wade Boggs and Ricky Henderson were 2 of the players who showed up on the biggest underperformance MVP voting, as can be seen here from the voting results from that year. Those were 2 players that stand out on the chart because their home run and RBI totals are generally well below everyone else on the chart. And even though their WAR totals are very high, it clearly wasn't something that resonated with voters. And on the flip side, looking at the 2008 National League MVP voting, where Ryan Howard was one of the top overperformers MVP voting, his home run and RBI totals were very high that year. His WAR was fairly low. So it seemed to align with the idea that it's the home run and RBI total stood out, and it was something that really appealed to the voters at that time. And the last thing that I wanted to look into was just the general analysis of trying to find out what was the impact of very extreme outlier performances by players and how that resonated with voters. So for this, I looked at, for these charts, I looked at home runs, RBIs, and average individually. I took players who had seasons that were greater than 1.5 standard deviations from the league mean for that year, and also were to have a WAR in the top 10 of the league to try and make sure I was filtering out players who were both had a very extreme season in one of these attributes while not necessarily being a traditionally well-rounded player, and see if they fared better in voting. And it can be generally seen that these players typically did fare better in voting that you'd expect, given they were in the top 10 in the league in WAR. Maybe that would mean they're not one of the top 10 players in the league, but frequently among the top 10 players in the league. For looking at home runs, for example, you could see a run there in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, where players with these outlier seasons were very frequently finished in the top 10 of MVP voting, and even almost always in the top 5 MP voting. But in recent years, as there's been more use of advanced analytics, you can see these players starting to drop out of the top 10 and even in some cases the top 15 of MVP voting results. And a similar trend holds up for RBIs. And though the actual with batting average doesn't seem to be any direct trend with extreme performances and automatically performing well in voting. And in comparison, looking at the same piece of information, but taking extreme outlier seasons with WAR. So for this, I chose greater than 1 standard deviation from the mean, and players who were not top 10 or top 5 in any of the Triple Crown offensive categories, to try and find players who are generally very well-rounded players, very good players, but also didn't have any standout offensive performances that would typically appeal to voters. And it can be seen here that the performance of these players in voting was generally pretty scattered up until about the past 10 years. We're starting to see those players really condense their their MVP voting performance within the top 10 and again, top 5 of the results. So just my general conclusions are that as the amount of analytics in baseball has increased by both teams and fans alike, the voting has become more aligned with that, and in the voting in general has been aligned with the discourse of conversation about the sport, and that extreme performances and home runs and RBIs still do get weighed in MVP voting. They're not quite as much, and team quality overall definitely is something that still is weighed heavily, even though it's something to an extent outside of the individual player's control. And so additional areas that I would want to look into further down the road is use a sample of more players. For this, I only looked at players who actually received MVP votes. Obviously, there are a lot more players than that in the league as a whole. And looking at certain factors that I talked about, such as market size or voter fatigue, how is that playing into things, as well as looking into eventually analysis on pitchers, and also looking into adding more advanced stats to my sort of analysis beyond just WAR and things like ERA and stadium adjusted metrics. So I guess, does anyone have any? So does anyone have any questions?
Well, I got one. So if you were recruiting for a new league and you were looking at the minor leagues, what would you look for?
So, I mean, well, so this is kind of a separate, I think there's a separate discussion between the overall quality of the player and the sort of what's factored into MVP voting. Ultimately, I would, if I'm building a team, would look for players, like I would prioritize WAR, and there's a host of other metrics that could ultimately be looked at down the road to decide who do we want, who would I want on my team, who I think is best. I think one of the main things is looking at just home runs and RBIs and batting average, which is historically what baseball analysis was until the last 20 or 30 years, is that those metrics are very isolated and just don't tell the whole story. The first thing is it's only your batting performance, but also a player may hit a bunch of home runs, but if you're only hitting that handful of that chunk of home runs and doing really nothing else, you're very limited in terms of your overall value.
Thank you.
I guess so. No additional questions. I'll move on to my next presentation or next project. So another project I'm going to talk about today is I built out our Shiny app to analyze what had the greatest impact on the sale price of used cars. So just quickly, some background. I think we all know cars are very important in American lifestyle, and just some numbers to hammer that down. And obviously, in the case of car sales, it's obviously not just new cars being sold. There's 35 to 40 million used cars sold per year in the United States. So the goal of my project was to find which factors have the biggest impact on the sale price of a used car, and to help shoppers find what is best for them within their price range and what they want. The analysis is primarily focused on the year and mileage of the car, but also looks at car specific attributes such as the drive type or number of cylinders in the car. And I also wanted to just look at how different makes and models are impacted by these factors. So the data set I downloaded from Kaggle contains information on 120,000 used cars sold in the US on eBay from 2018 to 2020. And it's just quick to note that the data was input by the sales lister, by the input on the sales listing by the seller. So certainly which I'll get into in a bit, there was some weirdness of the data at times, but we were working with that. And the data includes information ranging from the year the car was made and make and model, as well as to the car specific attributes. So just quickly, as far as how I was able to clean and filter out the data before actually doing my analysis, was there were definitely some abnormalities in the data itself, such as cars made well into the future, like the year 2914, or well in the past, like 1885, when as far as I know, cars didn't exist yet. And then also cars that just had very high mileage numbers, like cars over 1 billion miles. It just seemed, I didn't know necessarily what to do with that data. Clearly, it seems like there was some form of input error, and I felt it was best for me to just remove it from the data set and not worried about it. I also just tried to limit it to only make model combinations with at least 500 unique sales to make sure that there wasn't sort of a car with only one sale that suddenly threw things out of whack. And just quickly, I grouped the miles driven into buckets. I grouped the years into decades. And for the car specific attributes, I had to kind of manually map specific values for something like drive type of the car. Some values would be 4DR, some would be 4-wheel drive, and just trying to make sure I was lumping things together with what seemed like the best grouping of that value. So the first thing I looked at was just over the 3 years of the data set, 2018, 2020. Was there any trend? Was the year the car was sold impacting the price at all? And from looking at the data, it doesn't really seem that there was any direct impact. It seems like maybe a slight increase as the years went on, but there's also makes like Cadillac, where over the time frame, the actual sale price of the car went down a little bit. Ford, it dipped in 2019 before going back up in 2020. So it's just, it doesn't seem like there's any direct correlation between the year the car was sold and the actual final sale price of it. Next, I wanted to look at the impact of the mileage on the car itself. So for example, here looking at this, I chose 3 different models from my data set that I'll get into when it's like sort of quickly run through the app at the end. It actually allows you to select the makes and models that you want to do for your own analysis within the app. But here I chose the Camry, Corvette, and Mustang, and it can be seen that as there's more mileage on the car, the actual sale price of the car tends to trend downward, and that goes for more standard cars that you're probably just getting for the purposes of literally driving around places like a Camry, as well as more luxury cars like the Corvette or Mustang, where there's generally more value in the car itself. And again, just another way to look at the impact of the car mileage on the sale price of the car. It can be seen as mileage goes up, sale price generally trends down, though you get to a certain point around 100,000 miles. And while it still trends down, it's not as big of a drop off. It's also noticeable that there are outliers in the data set, particularly with cars for older decades, like made in the 1970s and 1960s, which indicates that's something that came up a lot in the analysis, that there's certainly other things that impact the value of a car that clearly people value certain cars for driving places and getting around it in an actual tangible thing. And also people value it as, say, a collector's item or a status symbol and things like that, where, say, mileage won't be as important. Next, I wanted to look at just how the sale price changed as by the year the car was made. And this kind of hammers down the point I just made home, where looking at the Camry, which is the red line on the bottom, the price of the Camry, it's the newer the Camry is, the higher the sale price will be, and that's pretty standard for it. Whereas you look at the Corvette, for example, and you go back to the 1960s, 1950s, and you start seeing the price jump up again, which would again indicate that there's additional value to the car, possibly beyond just, can we drive it? It's, I want to show this off to my friends, or I want to collect cars, whatever it may be. And so I also just wanted to quickly look into the car attributes. So within the data set, I had both engine type and the number of car cylinders. Ultimately, it wasn't something I could see any noticeable trend with. It seemed like in general, these were factors that other factors just have a greater impact on the sale price of a car. And ultimately that kind of comes down to the engine type, the number of cylinders. Can be cars from different years, different numbers of mileage. You don't necessarily have direct impacts on that. So it's something that doesn't as much have a direct impact on the car itself. And I also just added a quick table for users to sort of use on their own. And so my general conclusions are that when buying a used car, the mileage and year of the car remain the most important. After around 100,000 miles, there seems to definitely be a dip in the actual importance of the additional mileage. And car attributes, just the number of cylinders or the drive type of the car, simply aren't as significant of an impact. And just going down the road, things I would like to look into more is what's the collector value of certain cars. Also trying to parse out with the year of the car and mileage, what maybe matters more, because there's certainly a direct relationship between those two fields, where the older cars, you'd assume more miles, the newer cars, you'd assume fewer miles. Also getting information such as what's the average price of each car initially, to see what's the actual price drop off, not just the average sale price of the car. And also just getting things like appearance of the car. An older car may be in much better shape and a better place as a physical car than a newer car. So just knowing the year of the car isn't the tell-all, and that was something not in the data set. And so does anyone have any questions while I'm loading up the Shiny app? Because I can go through that quick as well.
So this is Daniel. So what is the takeaway from this analysis? So actually the mileage, the relationship between the mileage and then the car price, selling price will be quite straightforward. So
Sorry,
is there any
sorry, sorry, could you repeat that?
So actually, I just wanted to know what is the takeaway from this analysis. So actually, so in general, so mileage versus the sales price is quite straightforward. Is there any other interesting point when you analyze this data set?
Yeah, I mean, I think the conclusions I got were the kind of straightforward conclusions that the year of the car and the sale price was, or year of the car and the mileage had the greatest impact, which I think, I mean, it makes sense where I think in general, buying a used car, if you're buying a used car, I think, I'm assuming the first two, and if not two of the very first questions you will ask will be about that, because if you're trying to get a car to drive, those are things that will definitely impact how long going forward it will last. In the data set I used itself, it had a handful of car specific attributes, but I wasn't able to really discern any noticeable trend from those. And I know, and sort of other things I want to look into were just such as the overall quality of the car just wasn't something in the actual data set. So it's not something that I can make any assessment on there.
Could you go back to the chart that shows the car value based on like the 1960s? That one there. Yeah. So, okay. So that's you don't have the Chevrolet in there, do you?
So actually, so in the app, in the Shiny app I had built out, you are able to select the different makes and the models. So like Chevy, for example.
Yeah, I was wondering how the value from the 1950s looks, because it seems to be a collector.
Yeah, so yeah, it's a similar thing where the Chevy, for example, like it'll vary by make, but there's definitely some where you see price increases, and that's another thing where it's trying to quantify that certain cars clearly have collector's value and value beyond. Not everyone's buying a car so they could drive it places. People want a car because you just like the way it looks, or people are probably just also just more willing to spend time and money to refurbish a car if they value the actual make model more.
So where's the cutoff point from like collector car versus just an average drive around car, non-collector?
It definitely seems like once you get into around the 1980s or starting somewhere in the 1970s, you start to see that value pretty much taper off without any jump ups, though it's something where I would imagine there are certain models of cars that were made in the 70s or 80s that still have significant value, or I'm sure even not even just nice cars. I don't know if like those cars that were complete failures, like the Ford Pinto or whatever. I think that was the make, like maybe that one, which wasn't in my data set, maybe that's something where people could find and may value it more because there's some almost comedic value to owning it.
What's the green line there on the top?
So this line is the Corvette.
Corvette, and that's the same on the left over there on the 1960s?
Yeah. Yep. So, I mean, it's easier to see because you could also just eliminate you could select the models within the make that you want to, which ultimately will help it. So like here, you can see the Corvette is.
Yeah, cool. Quite valuable if it's old, quite valuable if it's new.
Yeah. And it seems like not in between, it's not much. And I mean, most of for the used car sales, most of it aligned with what I pretty much would have assumed ahead of time. But it's also always good when you actually look at the data and it spits out the output that you expected initially, which means that like, this is something that we as people are generally approaching in a correct manner.
All right, thank you.
So I guess, are there any other questions?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, those are the two products that I came here to discuss, and thank you for your time. Here's, I guess, my basic information.
Yes, if you are hiring or know someone is hiring, Ethan is available, and you have seen his work, please feel free to reach out to Ethan. And if you haven't signed up for our newsletter, you can go to nycdatascience.com and scroll down to the newsletter to get access to the content. Thank you everyone for your participation. Ethan, well done. Thank you so much for presenting today.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone have a good one.